in my own experience as a human being on the planet, I was always really struggling with there feeling like there was two different kind of worlds. And this inner experience of two worlds always puzzled me. And I was particularly fascinated with how you could study the nature of reality. And one way you do that is through science. And this conference, Science and Non-Duality, starts with that word science. And science is basically a disciplined way of studying the nature of reality that has incredible value. Incredible value. It has its serious limitations, especially with the human beings who conduct it. But as an approach to understanding reality, it's really quite valuable. So what we're going to look at are these basic questions of, through the lens of science, what is the mind, what is a healthy mind, and how can we cultivate a healthy mind and a healthy world? So in these questions, you might be surprised to find that the various disciplines that deal with this word mind turned out to not have a definition of what that word actually means. So I've written a lot about this in the last 25 years, and we won't get into that here. But by not actually taking a stance just as a working proposal, it really limits us. And then you can't say what a healthy mind is if you haven't said what a mind is, and then you don't even know how to cultivate one. So especially if you're a psychotherapist like I am, it's a little embarrassing, actually. If someone says, you're a therapist of my mind, what am I going to do? So at least we're going to start with 4 descriptors. When you say you have a subjective experience, some scientists would call that first-person experience, if you feel an interconnection with everyone in the room, right here, for example, that feeling is subjective sense. It doesn't make it less valuable. It just means it's really hard to measure it, and it's hard to know from outside your experience what's happening. So we use the word subjectivity. It doesn't mean it's not important. So when I was in medical school, subjectivity was completely ignored. So a person could be told they were dying, and a physician or a medical student was encouraged not to focus on the feelings that arise or the meanings. So how do you know you have those subjective experiences like feelings? Well, you have this thing called consciousness that you can actually start to look at from a scientific lens. And not everything is in consciousness. So when people say, oh, everything is in consciousness, I'd like to know how they're defining consciousness, because the way the cellular systems in your body are working right now are not in consciousness. And so these physiological processes that happen all the time demonstrate that it's, if you think of consciousness as a subjective experience of knowing something, of being aware, then we're not aware of most of what goes on. So that's just the nature of reality. But then there's a 4th aspect of the mind, which is rarely talked about, if ever, called self-organization. And it comes from a line of reasoning that says that energy flows through our subjective experience, consciousness, and even information processing, either as a conduit, where energy is flowing through like a hose, or like a constructor, where it takes these energy patterns and turns them in formation into information. Symbolizes something like the 2 + 3 on this slide. Now, energy then, as we can look at it deeply, is happening not just inside your body, just to use the bag of skin that encloses your body as a reference for an internal thing, it happens also in an inter-nature with other people and the planet. And so energy and information is one way to think about the system of mind. So one proposal is that when you look at it from a mathematical point of view, this system looked at this way as being embodied and relational has all the features of what's called a complex system. And when you look at the mathematics of complex systems in this universe we live in that you can study through mathematical principles and scientific observation are real things. Science is a real thing. And people say, oh, science is nothing. I don't know what universe they're living in. Because science can study things that are actually real. And of course, you go beneath the layers and layers and layers, and it becomes entangled and ultimately becomes energy fields, which are also studyable as probability fields, which we'll talk about in a moment. But energy and information can be studied. And this energy and information right now is happening inside your body, and it's happening between that body and the whole world around you, including our relational world, we'll just call it that way, with other people and with the planet. So it's just a way of saying, well, this is a complex system. And in our universe, complex systems have something called emergent phenomena. That is, the interaction of the elements of a system give rise to something more than just the elements themselves. That's just called emergence. And some scientists despise the word emergence, and just like any human beings, they could take a stance in saying that's not real or that's not real. Linear thinking scientists will hear a scientist talking about emergence, roll their eyes and say, that's dumb. That's not real. But a system scientist will say, that's actually a part of our universe. So even within science, you see, and especially within science, you see intense arguments. It's quite fascinating to see those arguments. So an emergent phenomena means that the whole is greater than its sum of its parts. So the idea is maybe the mind is an emergent phenomena of energy and information flow as it's arising within your body, including your brain, but also within the world around you of relationships with other people and with the planet. So the mind is both inner and inter. Now, when I first started saying this 25 years ago, mainstream academics were very upset about it, but that's okay. So what's interesting is one of those emergent phenomena is called self-organization. And if you say, well, how does self-organization work? It turns out that it optimizes the flow of this system by differentiating and linking. We're just going to name that integration. So integration, as I use it here, is going to be about linking differentiated parts. And when the system's not integrated, it goes to chaos or rigidity. When it goes to integration, it's coherent, which has these 5 qualities. It's flexible, F, it's adaptive, A, it's coherent, the mathematical property of resilience over time. It's energized and it's stable. That spells the word FACES. Some of you know I have an acronym addiction, and that's your first acronym for the day. Oh, there it is. FACES flow. So a FACES flow would define, I think, a healthy mind. So the mind can actually be defined as that self-organizing, embodied relational process that's regulating the flow of energy and information. And from that proposal back in 1992, you could hypothesize what future research would show, which is that integration is the basis of health. And so far, with my interns, we try to find anything that goes against that, and that's not what this talk is about, but every piece of scientific data we have supports the notion that integration is the basis of health. And all the books I write simply come down to that. How do we cultivate more integration in our world? And the second conciliant finding, conciliant means a common ground, because the field I work in, interpersonal neurobiology, we combine all the fields of science into one framework. We invite any other disciplined ways of studying reality to come into the tent and share. So we have contemplative traditions, various spiritual traditions that are joining with us in exploring these ideas. And so the second conciliant finding, besides integration as health, is that consciousness is needed for change. So with my patients back in the late 90s, I said, what if you could integrate consciousness? What would happen? So in my office, there's a table that looks like this. I would bring my patients up and say, let's differentiate the knowing of consciousness, that's called awareness, from the knowns, and there are a lot of knowns, and then let's take a spoke of attention and systematically move it around this wheel. No one wanted to call it the table of awareness, so it's like a wheel of awareness. So anyway, what was fascinating about that was when we did it, people's anxiety would reduce, their depression, mild to moderate, would get better, their traumas would be able to be dealt with more easily. If they had a medical illness and they were facing death, they could reduce severely their panic about dying. And it was absolutely fascinating. So I did it with my students who were therapists. They started finding improvements in their lives and their clients' lives. And then I did it systematically with 10,000 people. And since I'm a scientist, I care about reality and understanding it in a systematic way. And so I recorded all the results. And when people would take the microphone in these workshops, it was amazing how universal the findings were. They would feel a shift in their relationship with others and even with themselves, their internal sense of self. There would be a reduction in the chaos or rigidity, which showed that there were increases in integration. And what we're going to spend the rest of our 10 minutes on now is the finding when people would explore the hub itself. This is what they would say. They would, and we'd had this just yesterday or 2 days ago in the workshop, they would feel a sense of clarity, joy, this quality of something being empty yet full, expansive, infinite, eternity, God, love, peace, sense of belonging as a fundamental part of the whole, connected to others, the world, and the universe. So what that is, and you can do this practice from our website, we give it away for free, drdansiegel.com, and we've had lots and lots of people doing this, so we get lots of information. What this shows, basically, is that you can bend the spoke of attention around. So on the rim, you've got the first 5 senses, you've got the experience of the, I'll go back and show you this, you've got the experience of the interior sensations of the body, mental activities, and a sense of interconnection on the rim. But then what you can do is you can bend the spoke around, or for some it's better to retract the spoke, keep the spoke in the hub, or just be in the hub itself. And when people do this practice, that's when you get them saying these things. So the question scientifically is, why in the 10,000 person study, when people rest in the hub, would this be what they describe? So in trying to address that, you can go back to our original proposition that the mind is an emergent property of energy. And then when you ask physicists this question, this is what energy is defined as: the movement from possibility to actuality. So when they said that, I was in a meeting for a week with 150 physicists, mostly quantum physicists. I thought, oh my God, that is a view that helps us understand the wheel findings. And so here's what I think is going on. If I have, a word in my mind and we share a million words, it would be this space of maximal possibility. That would be that point on the bottom of this graph where it's 1 out of a million. It's called near zero. But once I say the word ocean, it's manifested as an actuality. And if you were a fly on the wall, you would say that energy just was flowing. You could do the same thing if it's 1 out of 10,000 words. You'd come from a higher place, from B there, 1 in 10,000, up to the 100% actualization. And if you map this out on a graph and made it 3-dimensional with diversity being in and out of the graph, this is a probability distribution curve from the vertical part of this diagram. The one going left to right is time or change, clock time. You would then realize at the bottom you have this thing called a plane of possibility. The plane of possibility is basically a mathematical space that could be considered the formless source of all form. It is, in quantum physics terms, called the sea of potential, or the quantum vacuum. So this is a scientific finding. The idea that we have this part of reality, before anything arises, it's a source of potential energy, so there's no energy in the plane, but energy arises from it. So then if you graph out our whole thing, you would say, well, then you've got 3 different P's there. You've got a plane, you've got that maximal place, which is empty of form, but full of possibility. Which is interesting, isn't it? You have plateaus, which are elevated probabilities, and then these peaks. So then, with this graph, you go, well, maybe this is what maps onto the wheel. And this is a proposal in my last 5 minutes that I'll share with you that's called the 3P diagram, because you got peaks and plateaus in a plane. Here's what I think is going on with consciousness and the mind. It's just a proposal. It could be completely wrong. So in science, you have to have the courage to be wrong and get rid of your ideas if they don't fit with the data. So far, what's been fascinating about it is not only does this model I'm about to describe to you fit the data of the 10,000 person study, but I've had people from the Hindu tradition, the Islamic tradition, the Buddhist tradition, the Christian tradition, the Jewish tradition, Native American traditions, the study of Qigong, Tai Chi, and other approaches as well that don't fit into those models, say that explains their whole tradition. Now, I don't have training in any of those traditions, so I just say that's consilient. That's really exciting. Maybe this could be, maybe, fitting with that, and maybe it's accurate. I don't know. So here's the idea, that a thought or an emotion or a memory is a peak when possible becomes actual. The sub-peak values are thinking, emoting, and remembering. And then you have a state of mind, which would be an elevated, basically, plateau that's a filter of consciousness that only allows certain peaks to arise. Like if I'm in a shame state, I might have thoughts that come up, I'm no good, memories of bad things that have happened to me, a feeling inside of me like I'm lousy and defective. That'd be a shame state. And in a therapy session just recently, I worked with a client, a patient, where it was clear that this person was filled with shame but couldn't be aware of it, and was filled with all these particular peaks that arose. My job was to get her to the plane of possibility. And as you can see in this graph, I think what's happening is that the experience of being aware, the experience of being conscious, is actually when you're in the plane of possibility. So it's just a proposal. Again, it could be completely wrong, but this 3P framework proposes the origin of consciousness is when energy's probability has dropped out of these above plane values and has dropped into the plane of possibility. So for this client, what I needed to do then was I needed to help this person drop beneath the plateau into pure awareness. And so if you think about those words that people said, there are 7 implications that in my last 2 minutes I'm going to summarize for you of this proposal. Number 1, the plane of possibility may be the origin of consciousness. It's just a proposal. It could be wrong, but it might be that. Why that would be true, I don't know. But it's an interesting thing to see if it fits with spiritual traditions and science. Number 2, the plane of possibility, that hub of the wheel, is the pause between impulse and action. It gives you a space between those peaks so you can actually have choice. But why would you have a choice just with a pause? Why not just repeat what you're going to do? This gets to implication number 3, which is all other options rest in the plane. So you're not only aware and making a pause, but you're dropping your mind into the exact space where other choices arise. So with this client in the session, instead of this person being lost in shame and getting ready to have all sorts of horrible things happen in their life, I could help them move to the spaciousness of other options. That's number 3. Number 4, love seems to arise from the plane of possibility. And that's exactly what happened with that client. They could begin to love themselves. And there's all sorts of reasons to talk about why that would be the case. But part of it is, this is implication number 5, is that each of us have a plane of possibility that's basically identical. Your plane and your plane, that's where we find each other. We're differentiated in our plateaus and peaks. We find our common ground, our linkage in the plane. So the more we can drop people into this spacious, receptive awareness of the hub of the wheel, the more we're going to find our connection with each other. So that's number 5. And the last 2, number 6, in this quantum state, in this sea of potential, this quantum vacuum, you probably know this, but there is no arrow of time. There's an arrow of time in what's called the Newtonian classical macrostate world of these large bodies. You crack an egg, you can't uncrack an egg. There's a directionality of time, even a directionality of change, even if there's no such thing as time that exists. But in the quantum realm, and you probably know this, and this helps me understand my childhood, we have two realms in science. Two realms have been established. And if you get Scientific American, a conservative public science journal, you know the cover story. The month before my book Aware came out, the cover story was, when does the quantum realm become the classical realm? So this is solid science. The quantum realm is referring to quanta of energy, small units of energy, like an electron or a photon, maybe even the mind. And the mind is capable of dropping into this quantum realm, just like you can swim in a pool and you're swimming and doing the breaststroke. Sometimes you're in the underwater realm, then you come up in the air realm. So what this 3P diagram allows us to see through the 3P framework is that you can drop your mind into this timeless state of eternity. And if you notice, it's not only eternity, it's infinity. Some people who I work with would call that source. Some people who I work with would call that God. In fact, from a scientific point of view, it's the God, the generator of diversity. And that doesn't offend my religious colleagues. So that's kind of interesting. So that's number 6. And the final thing I'll just say is number 7. In 2015, a paper was published in a physics journal called Closing the Final Loophole. And there are a lot of controversial things in science. For example, in quantum physics, we don't know really what the act of observation does to collapse the probability function. We don't understand it very much, but we're really interested in it. That's a very controversial issue. What has become not controversial is that at least in the quantum realm of microstates, entanglement is a proven aspect of our universe. Entanglement is where you pair up two quanta of energy, and they have a relationality to them. One spins clockwise, the other has to spin counterclockwise. You make A go the other way, B's got to flip around the other way, fine. You separate them out by an inch, they still do it. A foot, 10 feet, 10 miles, 1,000 miles. Instantaneously they change. It's not a force going between things, like sending energy, like these light bulbs sending energy to me. It's not a force. Nothing goes faster than the speed of light. What the issue is that entanglement is that the Newtonian view of spatial separation doesn't impede the relational interconnections of paired quanta. That's now been proven. So what I think happens at times, and we can just ask the question here and I'll close with this, is how many of you have had an experience where a person you are close to emotionally, personally, they're a part of your life, is physically, in the Newtonian world, physically separated you in space, what we call in Newtonian macrostate classical physics terms, spatial separation, where things are like nouns and things are like, entities, and we have to say it's separate from us. How many of you have had a sense of communication, a clear message that was so specific, it could not have been a coincidence with someone who's physically separated from you? Raise your hand really, really high so we can see. So take a look around. It looks like, about half, maybe? Half of us. Okay, so that's just interesting. And this could explain it possibly, because if the mind is truly an emergent property of energy, if that's true, that could be wrong, but if it's true, and since science has established that entanglement exists, it would be kind of weird if we didn't have the capacity to have entangled communications that are called non-local. And that's how this 3P framework helps us see that ultimately science and spirituality probably never should have been separated. The idea of leading a meaningful, connected, interconnected life and a disciplined way of studying things, science and spirituality can come together. And when we explore things rigorously in both contemplative practice, spiritual practice, and in scientific study, we're coming to a place now where we can recognize the deeply interconnected nature. And when you drop into the plane of possibility, when you access this hub, you actually liberate presence and the capacity for integration to arise. And integration made visible is love, kindness, and compassion. And what better world can we all try to create from beginning with this open presence and being here for each other on the planet? Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you.